And welcome back to EDH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo, and these are 5 cards that I have been desperately trying to make work in the Commander format for a long time and have thus far been unsuccessful. You can think of this as a video where I would normally name, hey, here's 5 cards you should be putting in your Commander decks, right? These are all 5 cards that I think are very interesting, that could be really good in certain decks, and I will give some suggestions of where you can use them. But for me personally, these are cards that I've been trying to make work just because I find them unique and interesting, and I just think there's some great ways to use them, but I just don't particularly have decks myself where they fit. I have tried to use them, not too much success though. And hopefully, again, we can find out some better ways to use them. You guys can help me think of some ways to use these cards. So let's start out at number 1 with Mage Ascension. And I think I've mentioned this before on my channel about a card that I've been wanting to make work because I think it can absolutely be bonkers. 2 and a blue enchantment. At the beginning of each end step, if you drew 2 or more cards this turn, you may put a quest counter on Mage Ascension. Okay, that doesn't seem too bad, right? Not really that difficult to draw more than 1 card in a turn, right? As long as Mage Ascension has 6 or more quest counters on it, if you would draw a card, you may instead search your library for a card and put it into your hand and shuffle. So if you would draw a card, instead you get to tutor. And this is not, once each turn or something like that. If you cast a wheel and drew 7 cards, you would then get to tutor for 7 cards and put them into your hand. Obviously, that's a bonkers, incredibly powerful ability, in particular where there is a deck you want to specifically looking for certain pieces. How hard is it to get though? This is a card I've actually used in several different decks, most recently in my Reign Academy Chancellor deck, where I thought, okay, there's a commander that if it is enchanted, someone targets one of my things, I get to draw 2 cards, and then on the end of each end step, this is every end step, which makes it not as hard as you might think, I'll get to put a counter on it. 6 is a lot though, right? That's the thing. And I think in the maybe 3 or 4 times I actually had this card in play in that deck, I actually got the 6 counters on it only once. There are other decks other than my Reign Academy Chancellor deck that actually draw cards a lot better than that deck does. That deck, obviously, I rely on people targeting my stuff in order to draw the cards. So there, it's a little more iffy whether I get there. I only got to the 6 counters once, and before I actually got to draw a card and go search my library, someone destroyed it. So I never have actually gotten to use that ability, which of course is obviously really powerful. I think this card goes really well. A couple of suggestions from me. I think this card is good in a deck where you're already like a Min Wily Illusionist deck where you're already are doing the draw your second card each turn thing. In fact, there's that brand new commander, the Kraken, that wants you to be drawing cards on your opponent's turn, where this might be a fantastic fit because all you would have to do, again, cast a frantic search. You're getting the trigger already off your commander, and then on that end step, because this triggers every end step, you will get the counter on it. So you could get the counters a lot more quickly, right? You don't want to just draw 2 cards on your turn, right? There's a lot of decks that can draw 2 cards on your turn, but if you wait 6 complete turns, like you play this on turn 3 and then wait 6 turns before you can actually use it, game might be over by then, right? You want to get them on there a lot faster. So a deck like that, it might work. Also, I think the new Azuri, the Proliferate Azuri, that has the card draw trigger, right? Because Proliferate is another thing you can do here where I don't want to wait 6 turns or however many turns to use this. I can put it in a deck where I'm proliferating. Play this right away. I draw that extra card on my turn. And when I'm proliferating, I proliferate the counter on this guy. And because you basically would get it out doubly as fast, I think, because you're doing the card draw thing and also the proliferate thing. So if you got a deck like that, might want to consider this thing because, of course, if you get to that 6 counters, it's just ridiculously powerful, obviously. All right, moving on to number 2. Again, another card I have mentioned on this channel before, and this is a very recent one, False Floor. Came out in New Capenna, 4-mana artifact. False Floor enters the battlefield tapped. Creatures enter the battlefield tapped, which that on its own could be good in certain decks. This does slow your opponents down. If I'm playing against a really fast deck, maybe a Crankle deck or something like that, just having creatures enter the battlefield tapped can be helpful. If you're in a sort of a pillow fort strategy, a lot of people will play cards like that just to slow their opponents down. This could be helpful that way. your creatures enter the battlefield tap 2, which maybe isn't great. Pay 2 and tap exile false floor, exile all untapped creatures, activate only as a sorcery. It's such a unique, interesting ability. And I've talked about this card before. You know, I talked about it in a video recently about cards that I was really excited about, and it turned out, you know, I have a couple of these sitting in my collection right now, not using them because I really wanted to use this card. I wanted it to be good, and I haven't figured out a great way to use it yet. However, I do have a couple of ways that I think it might work good. Again, not for me personally. I don't have any decks where this works, but I do have some suggestions for you guys. I had mentioned Breaking Wave in a video recently, where that's a neat little combo with this card where you can use it to tap your creatures and untap all your opponent's creatures, and then use this to exile all your opponent's creatures, right? That's how I want to use this card. I want to use this card as much as I can a one-sided board wipe for myself. So I want my creatures to be tapped and my opponent's creatures to be untapped, which on my turn is usually not the case, right? That's what makes this card difficult to use. Any deck where you are tapping down your own creatures, though, I think this might be a great option. I had mentioned the Archmandrite, and I was doing a deck doctor from one of my patrons where I thought, hey, this might be a great fit because your commander has an ability where it taps down its own creatures. So you can, on your turn, tap down your own creatures for that ability. And then that way, when you activate your false floor, all your creatures are tapped. You don't have to worry about losing any. So are you going to get all of your opponent's creatures? Probably not. They probably have some tapped creatures that won't get exiled, but they probably also have some untapped creatures. Like a lot of commanders, people don't want to be attacking with or tapping. They just sit there. You'll probably hit a lot of commanders with this as well. It's only 2 mana to exile all untapped creatures. It's not a lot. So a deck where you're tapping down all your creatures might be a good fit for it. A vehicles deck, I thought, would be a great fit for it. There are a few vehicles commanders out there. And of course, when you crew vehicles, you're tapping down your creatures and you can tap down as many as you want. So a vehicle commander might be a great fit for this card because it might be, again, for sure, it's not hitting any of your creatures because I'm going to tap down all my creatures to crew my vehicles. And then, of course, my vehicles become creatures, but then I just attack with them, right? Attack with all my vehicles, then all my stuff is tapped, and I will not lose anything to the false floor. And I might get a few things off of my opponents, might get all their creatures if I get lucky, right? So might be a good fit there as well. Throwing out some ideas. I think this is a really unique, interesting card, and it's a fun one to try to make work in a commander game. And I think those suggestions I made, it might actually work. I don't have any of those decks. I don't have a vehicle deck. So for me, this doesn't actually fit in any of my decks, unfortunately, because I think it's a really neat card and I want to use it. Next up at number 3, again in the tapping theme, interestingly enough. So maybe these two cards fit together. Crackle Burr. And this is a really old card, a card that I actually used in Modern, that I tried to make work in Modern, that I actually think was pretty good there. I think it's a really neat card. And every time I make an Izzet deck, a lot of times I'll just throw this in there, even though me and Izzet don't really go well together, as I've talked about before also. But every time I make an Izzet deck, I throw this guy in there and I want to try to make it work because I think it's a really neat card. So 1 and 2 hybrid Izzet mana. So blue and a red, 3 mana total, elemental 2/2. Pay 2 hybrid Izzet mana and tap. Tap 2 untapped red creatures you control. So you're going to tap this guy and you're going to tap 2 other red creatures you control. And Crackle Burr deals 3 damage to any target. That's not bad. So you're tapping down 3 creatures and 2 mana to deal 3 damage to any target. But then you pay 2 Izzet mana and the untap ability, which we don't see very often, and untap 2 tapped blue creatures you control to return target creature owner's hand. So if you can do both of these, you tap this and your Crackle Burr and the creatures and deal 3 damage, and then you can untap it and 2 other creatures and bounce a creature as well. That's pretty good value for 4 mana, I think. And at the end of the day, like, your creatures are all untapped, which is probably what you want. And if you have more mana, you can do it again, right? Because this creature has a tap and untap ability, as long as you have the mana open, you can just keep doing this and doing this and doing this, right? Now, what makes this really good, because of course people say, well, what if I don't have 2 tapped blue creatures? If the creatures you are using are both blue and red, you can use the same creatures. If I have 3 creatures in play that are both blue and red, I can tap them all to use the first ability, untap them all to use the second ability, and of course, continue possibly if I have the mana to do so. I think it's a really neat creature, and I think it can fit in certain decks. And again, I did a deck doctor recently where I actually found a great commander where it is a perfect fit, in my opinion, Saint Traft and Rim Corollas. There is a commander that wants to be both untapped and tapped, because of course, you want to be tapping it multiple times. And Crackle Burr is a great way to tap your commander and untap your commander, And again, Saint Traft and Rem Corollas is both red and blue, so it works with both Crackle Burr's abilities. Again, I don't have one of these decks, so for me, I can't be using it there. But if you have one of those decks, I think Crackle Burr is a fantastic fit with that commander and a really interesting one as well. Next up at number 4, again, another card I've mentioned a few times. And I think, again, I mentioned it in that video where it's a card I was super excited about and I wanted to use. And I tried using it in a couple decks and it just wasn't working. It's a tough one to use. Evolving Door, 2 and a green artifact, pay 1 and tap. Sacrifice a creature. Count the colors of the sacrificed creature. Then search your library for a creature card that's exactly that many colors plus 1. Exile that card. Then shuffle. You may cast the exiled card, activate only as a sorcery. So, the color combinations thing is tough. I just talked about this again in a recent video recently about Ovaya Pashiri, a deck that I had made where you have a mono green commander, but it's making colorless tokens. So you can sack those colorless tokens to go get a mono green creature and cast it. I thought it was a great fit there. Of course, again, I don't have that deck. I tried it in a couple decks of mine. It didn't work great. The difficult part here is you have to sacrifice a creature. That creature has to be 1 less color than the creature you're getting. So if you have a 2-color deck, I had this in my Shanna deck, I would have to sacrifice a mono white or mono green creature to then go get a 2-color creature. So I could only get 2-color creatures out of my deck, which I did have a few, not a lot, but then I also had to be able to cast that creature, right? You need the mana to cast a creature. You can't just exile and then cast it at your leisure. You have to cast it right away, so you have to have the mana open. That's the part that makes this really difficult. However, I do have a couple of neat ways to use this card. First of all, if you are in an exile tribal deck in green, Faldorn, which another commander I've talked about recently, this is a great fit. This is casting a spell from exile that a lot of people might not realize. That's what this is doing. So if you're in any of those exile tribal commanders that happen to be in green, I don't know if there's a lot. Again, Faldorn is one I can think of. This is exiling the card and then casting the card from exile. So you are casting a card from exile with this card. So it might work in some of those exile tribal decks. Give it a consideration there maybe. Also is a really neat combo, sort of, I think, with Tillankali Hunter. I'm not sure how to pronounce that name, but it has a very unique and interesting ability. And of course, it also works in those exile tribal decks and works particularly well with Evolving Door. I just think it's a funny fit. It's an adventure card. The adventure part we don't care about. We care about the creature side, which unfortunately costs 7 mana. So that makes this really difficult. 5 green, 7/7 creature with trample. Once each turn, you may pay 0 rather than pay the mana cost for a creature spell you cast from exile. And guess what? That's what our Evolving Door is doing. It is casting a creature spell from exile. What a match made in heaven this is. I think it's a funny one. If you have a deck where this little combo might actually fit, it would be great to do. Of course, with your Tillankali Hunter in play, what I'm going to do now is, again, the color combination matters, but now the casting cost no longer matters. I can sacrifice a mono green creature and go get my Coma Cosmos Serpent out of my library, assuming I'm playing a Simic deck. I have to pay the 7 normally to cast that with my Evolving Door, but Tillankali Hunter says you may pay 0 rather than pay the mana cost for a creature spell you cast from exile, which is what you're doing with Evolving Door. So there is a really neat, interesting way to use Evolving Door. Again, fits in the exile tribal if you happen to be in a green deck that is doing that, so maybe try fitting it in there as well. Unfortunately, it's a card that doesn't work in any of my decks, but it is a really neat card. And lastly today, coming in at number 5, another oldie but a goodie, going way back to Tempest Block, the first set I ever actually bought. Tempest Block obviously is a very nostalgic set for me, and this is one of the very first multicolored cards I ever opened, which, you know, opening multicolored cards back then was, I don't know, I found it to be a big deal. I thought they looked really cool, and this is such a unique, interesting card. It is multicolored, but it's doing something that is not what you normally see in this colors, which is why it's a difficult card to use, but I think it's a really neat card. Dracoplasm, blue and a red shapeshifter 0/0 with flying. As Dracoplasm enters the battlefield, sacrifice any number of creatures. Dracoplasm's power becomes the total power of those creatures, and its toughness becomes their total toughness. Also has that pumpable dragon effect, right? Pay red, Dracoplasm gets +1/+0 until end of turn. And the picture kind of looks like a dragon. And I was always curious about the art here. It's like, okay, is this guy a dragon? It's actually a shapeshifter, which is of course kind of what the ability is doing, but it's a shapeshifter that's sort of doing a dragony thing because it has the flying and it has the pumpable dragon effect that you usually see. It's a really interesting card. Obviously, you are sacrificing creatures, but in Izzet colors, which you don't usually see. Where does this card fit? You know, I would love for people to let me know in the comments. First of all, can you find a neat place for this card to fit? What commander, what deck? Or maybe even better, are you already using this? And in what deck are you using it? I have tried this in a deck before with Ruhan for Mori. That is a commander where I think this is a good fit because, of course, you have a commander that's obviously in the right colors. It's a 4-mana 7/7, but it sort of has that drawback of you have to attack someone at random. And I thought Dracoplasm was a good fit there, and I briefly tried that deck out where I can cast my Dracoplasm for only 2 mana, I sacrifice my commander and any other creatures I want as well. Now I have a 7/7 flyer that is pumpable that, you know, it's not commander damage, which I know a lot of people are looking for with Ruhan, but I have a 7/7 flyer for 2 mana that is pumpable that I can attack whoever I want with. It doesn't have to be random. So I thought it might be a good fit there. Where is the Izzet deck where I'm sacrificing lots of creatures? You know, is there one? Another interesting fit I thought is if I'm sacrificing creatures anyway. And again, that's not something you see a lot in Izzet colors. That's why this is difficult to use. But if I have, let's say, a card that is spitting out those tokens that are going to get exiled on the end step anyway, right? There are lots of those in red for sure, right? If I have any of those cards, so maybe if you have a deck in Izzet colors that's doing that, I'm spitting out those tokens. I'm spitting out elemental tokens that have haste, that get to attack right away, but then I have to exile them or sacrifice them on the end step. I attack with them. Then on my second main phase, I cast my Dracoplasm, sacrifice all those guys, and I can end up getting a really huge, scary flyer from a bunch of tokens that I was just going to sacrifice anyway. Might be a good fit there as well. I just love this card. It's a card that I've been wanting to put in a deck. And funny enough, I got 2 Izzet cards on this list that I really, really want to play. And I don't have an Izzet deck. You know, again, I made the video about why Izzet. I don't know why, for some reason, Izzet colors and Izzet commanders just rub me the wrong way. And I can never seem to hold an Izzet deck together. If I ever make one, maybe I'll try to fit both of these cards in there because I really love them both. And they sort of do fit with each other a little bit. Let me know if you're using any of these cards in the comments below. I'd love to know how you're using them. They are all very interesting cards. They sort of hold a special place in my heart, a lot of them. I think they're janky in a way, but also they can be really good at the same time. Where are you using them? Let me know where you're using these cards in the comments below. That is it for today, though, and thanks for tuning in.